So let's start on the last part of our nervous system, as the nervous system part C. So it has two major subunits, the motor part and the integrative neurophysiology. So last time we covered the sensory part, and in the morning we were able to conclude with the spatial senses. So in this session I will be focusing on the peripheral part of the motor. So that is the motor function of the spinal cord and maybe the cord reflexes. So let's examine some of the brief physiological processes that you are likely to see. Of course, we remember some information about the spinal cord. We are able to appreciate some basic arrangement or maybe the organization of the spinal cord, where we are able to say that the dorsal part is likely to contain the sensory part, while the anterior part is likely to contain the motor part. So this is in respect to how the spinal nerves are likely to get out of the spinal cord, or how some other nerves are likely to advance through the spinal cord. So the sensory part on the posterior part, as you're able to see in the image, while the anterior part should be containing the roots of the motor part. So what we'll be exploring in this topic will just be revolving around these neurons, and of course how they interact with the muscles to be able to execute the movement that we've been suggesting. So remember, in our introduction of the motor, we talked about several control units, some from the brain, some from the spinal cord, that are able to control skeletal movement. We majorly divided this into two, the voluntary part and the involuntary. The voluntary part was with the initiation of the movement, but the involuntary part is everything that happens in the background of the movement to make sure that you'll be able to have an efficient movement. So we were able to suggest some of the neuronal tracts or some of the spinal cord tracts that are likely to be explored or that are likely to be used, and those were the descending. Remember, the descending are getting the information from the higher region of the brain, or maybe from the higher region of the spinal cord as it descend downwards. So we expect things like the corticospinal, the cerebrospinal, and many other tracts. So these tracts should be able to connect with maybe the interneurons, and again after the interneurons connects with the motor neurons, that is of the lower part, so that by the end of the day, when these motor neurons interact with the muscles, they'll be getting all the information from the different tracts that exist within the spinal cord. So we are acknowledging that in the spinal cord we can be having many tracts that is giving us you can say, different aspect of the movement. In the morning we are able to suggest that for you to have a good movement, the eye need to have contributed. The body of the muscle needs to take into consideration the balance or maybe the position of the head. So all these various tracts are likely to feed the lower motor neurons, so that at the end of the day, the lower motor neurons will be able to propagate this electrical impulse to cause some coordinated form of movement that put into consideration all the important aspects that we suggested. So when you think of the brain, or maybe the CNS, we suggested that this is an integratory unit. That is the spinal cord and the brain. So we all agree that not every sensory impulse needs to reach the brain for the generation of motor impulse. Some get through the spinal cord to the dorsal horn and connects to the ventral neurons via the interneurons to give us the motor reflex, or the motor reflex arc that we are able to suggest, as you are able to see in the diagram. So assume we are having the sensory nerves getting into the sensory root as it advances through the spinal cord. They are giving the spinal cord information about the position of the muscles, so giving us the information about the muscles. Basically a change in tone and a change in length. So this gets into the spinal cord, they join the interneurons, and then through the interneurons they are able to stimulate the motor. But you'll be able to see that most of the time, not most of the time, sometimes you can get the sensory neurons just getting into the spinal cord, but they don't use the interneuron. They'll just join the anterior motor neurons directly. So this representing a kind of shorter pathway compared to this other pathway where you need to join the interneuron before you stimulate the motor neuron. So we'll be able to see some of the differences, especially when it comes to reflex, because when you talk of the motor system, you also think of the reflex. And we suggested that reflex represent the motor domain that actually requires a quick response, most of the time without massive involvement of the brain. That's why we are suggesting that not all the information from the spinal cord or from the peripheral needs to get through the brain. Some do not reach the brain, some are just locally integrated. It could be within the ganglion before the spinal cord, some could be within the spinal cord. So those that needs to be integrated within maybe the ganglia or the spinal cord represents some type of information that needs to be processed and acted upon immediately, where the body, not the body really, but where the brain is not likely to be aware of. So remember the arrangement of the spinal cord, where we suggested the gray matter and the white matter. The gray matter, we suggested that it is a group of cell bodies. So having that it is a group of cell bodies, you can almost have the perception that that is an integratory area, where it can be a point of synapse, where if you have some cell body, remember the cell body, on the cell bodies we normally have some fibers extended, so that is the receptor. They can be able to meet with axonal end of many neurons, and it is because of that it is because of this simple arrangement that makes this an integratory area. So for example, just think of a cell body with many dendrites. Of course, with the dendrites we expect many receptors, so picking many information from many axonal end and then integrating it into one unit. So this is specifically what we'll be referring to with the lower motor neurons, because remember all the tracts that normally exist within the spinal cord. So they are able to be integrated most of the time through the interneurons, or maybe directly through the lower anterior motor neurons. And then all this information will be integrated in one neuron. So this neuron will be rich in terms of information from maybe the corticospinal, the rubrospinal, and the other tracts that are there within the spinal cord. So it is basically an integratory area. So the dorsal part containing the sensory part, while the ventral containing the motor, as we suggested. So the simple mechanism or the simple rule still applies. So sensory signals are likely to enter almost entirely through the sensory posterior roots. After entering the cord, every sensory signal travels into two separated destinations, and this is what we suggested. So remember, maybe proprioception signals that need to be transformed to the brain. So this is one of the modality that we are referring to. So this modality can either or rather impulses representing that modality can get into the spinal cord, while in the spinal cord they can be locally integrated so that it is reverted back through the lower neurons, or it can ascend upwards using the tracts to be able to reach the upper segment of the spinal cord, or sometimes terminate into the higher areas of the brain. So if you are able to remember the track, you are able to map the destination of these electrical impulses that will be emanating from the sensory part. So again, what we need to remember, as we suggested during our anatomical introduction part, so we have the gray matter over here, so just a brief, and the white matter. Not perfect, but something like this. So what you need to remember, the sensory is normally on the posterior, and before they get into the spinal cord, they are likely to have a point of synapse. So this is what we are referring to some form of ganglion. So it's normally there on the sensory part, while this represents the motor. So for convenient purpose, can represent this with the arrows representing the flow of information. So what is important, it is the integration that ordinarily will occur over here. So here we expect some cell bodies. So a cell body representing the genesis of the lower motor neurons. The same over here, or point of synapse with the axonal end of the sensory neurons in the dorsal part. So sometimes this can join directly, or they can join through the interneurons, or sometimes they can join other ascending tract to go into specific area of the brain, as we are able to suggest. And of course, this depends on the modality that is being transmitted, where we are able to see different modality are likely to follow different tracks. So let's remember that. So once we have our sensory information in the spinal cord, they can have two separate destinations. One branch of the sensory nerves terminates almost immediately on the gray matter of the spinal cord to elicit the local segmental cord reflexes. So this is something like this, having these nerves entering and then just joining with this. So it means our sensory is directly or indirectly stimulating the lower motor neurons to be able to give us a response. So if you can see anatomically, this is a short pathway because we've largely ignored the brain. So we've just used the impulse to stimulate the lower motor neurons. So over here, you expect some form of reflex. It is a reflex because the brain is not involved in the decision making. So the decision making is just integrated here locally. So one of the reasons why this becomes also part of the CNS, or sometimes they can get into the tract to be transmitted into the higher region of the brain. So it depends on the particular modality that is being transmitted. So whether the spinothalamic tract or the spinocerebellar tract, as we were able to suggest last time. So away from the sensory part, we are suggesting the most important neurons when it comes to the motor control are the anterior motor neurons. Not necessarily anterior motor neurons, but motor neurons. So with the anterior, we are just adding the anterior to acknowledge that the motor neurons, most of the time, they are likely to be on the anterior part of the spinal cord. So these are the anterior motor neurons. So they are very important in controlling the muscle movement. So as we've just suggested, they are likely to be fed by a lot of signal from many tracts. And these tracts are providing different information that will be able to modulate movement. Maybe giving it information about the depth of the area, maybe giving it information about the strength of the joints, the strength of the muscles, and how maybe it need to readjust. Maybe giving it appraisal on where it is going in terms of the vision, because with the vision, that information of the vision, it can be mathematically translated by the muscles to be able to give it the appropriate steps that are needed by the individual. So it is good to note that when it comes to the motor neurons, we have the two major types of motor neurons. So again, these types they are categorized depending on their size or where they are likely to end up anatomically. So you are seeing here we are having the alpha motor neurons and the gamma motor neurons. So if you look into our image, just try and track where is the motor neuron. So we are seeing the motor actually represented by a black. So advancing all the way into the muscle, and we also have the gamma over here advancing all the way into the muscle. But what you should be able to notice, they are ending up at different areas. So this point of the muscles is referred to as the Golgi tendon area. So whereby upon stimulation of this area, we are likely to see some changes in terms of maybe the strength of the muscle, or maybe something like tone. We are seeing the gamma advancing all the way to a particular area of the muscle. So this specific area is referred to as the muscle spindle. Remember, while we were talking about the muscle, we said that the muscle has two major types of receptors, the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindle. So the Golgi tendon is likely to give us information about the strength, while the muscle spindle is likely to give us information of the muscle about the length. Because now, if you think of it in a form of reflex, the body's or rather the motor part is giving us appropriate kind of reply. So for example, just think of it in some sensory aspect. So think of it in some sensory aspect where we are having the muscle spindle. So you are able to see the muscle spindle over here. Maybe there are some changes in terms of length of the muscle. So the information, that change in terms of length will be able to trigger some impulse or maybe generate some impulse that are likely to be transmitted by a certain type of sensory nerve. So that is the type A, type 1A, that is, all the way to the spinal cord. So if you can just follow the green line over here, so just see how it is advancing. So we are still having our green. So of course the ganglion just before entry. While entering, it will go all the way up to the lower motor neuron. I hope you are noticing that. So what is unique with the type 1A is that when they are activated and they advance into the spinal cord, rather than using the interneurons, as you are able to see over here, this short group of muscle within the short group of nerves within the dorsal horns are normally ignored by the type 1A. So this should be able to give you a clue that it is highly likely that now that this is having a kind of shorter pathway, it is highly likely that the information relayed by the type 1A is kind of faster compared to the type 1B, where the type 1B, if you follow the blue line, it is likely to synapse with the interneuron before it stimulates the Golgi. It stimulates the alpha neurons. So these are very important. So anytime you are talking about the reflex or the anatomical mapping of the reflex or the physiological mapping of the reflex, you are literally telling us a story from the receptor all the way to the point of integration and back using a certain type of nerve all the way to the same area that caused the excitation. I hope you are able to see that, but as primitive, just know that we have two types of anterior motor neurons, alpha motor neurons and gamma motor neurons. Why should they be two? Because we are supplying different areas of the muscles. We know the two major types of the receptors that is able to give us two distinct but important information within the muscles. So we also need appropriate reply to the specific anatomical area within the muscle. So a little bit about the alpha neurons or the alpha motor neurons. So these are part of the lower motor neurons that are waits to be activated either by the descending tracts, or they can be activated locally by the incoming sensory impulses from the sensory nerves, so that we are able to see the type 1, could be the type 1A or the type 1B. So the alpha motor neurons give rise to large type A alpha motor nerve fibers averaging around 14 micrometer in diameter. So these fibers branch many times after they enter the muscles and intervene or maybe innervate the large skeletal muscle fiber. They are likely to stimulate a wide area, so that is stimulation of a single alpha nerve fiber excite anywhere from around 3 to several hundred skeletal muscle fibers, so which are collectively known as the motor unit. So remember what we suggested with the motor unit, the kind of neurotransmitter that is likely to be used in this area should be acetylcholine, acting on the nicotinic receptors. So that means the alpha motor neurons relates with the muscle fibers by the use of a specific receptor called the nicotinic receptor, and while at the same time using a responsive neurotransmitter called the acetylcholine. We also have the gamma, which is much smaller in size. You are able to see that around 5 micrometer. So this is to tell you that it is likely to transmit impulses at a slower rate compared to the alpha motor neuron. So a type A gamma motor nerves fiber averaging around 5 micrometer in diameter, which go to small special skeletal muscle fibers called the intrafusial fiber. So intrafusial fiber, this is where you anticipate to have now the muscle spindle. The muscle spindle just represents some anatomical arrangement of how this receptor is likely to look. So just think of a fiber. So maybe muscles, we know they consist of many fibers. So have a view. So whereby if you have the intrafusial, you are likely to have some spiraling around. Neurons are likely to spiral around a particular fiber. So this area is referred to as the intrafusal region, while this other area outside the intrafusal is normally referred to as the extrafusal. So that means the alpha motor neurons will end up at the extrafusal, where you expect to have some Golgi tendon, while the gamma motor neurons will end up at the intrafusal fibers region, where you expect to find the muscle spindle. So where these are very important, especially when it comes to examination of the muscle. So sometimes there could be some changes in terms of length, but not necessarily with the match tone. So we need to acknowledge that. So this is a good image to illustrate on what we just suggested, that we have two major types of motor neurons, the alpha and the gamma. The gamma is likely to end up in the intrafusal area. What is an intrafusal area? This is where we expect to have some muscle spindle. Why are they muscle spindle? It is a muscle spindle because we are having fiber spiral with some nerve ends, where the nerve ends they are convenient. That is an anatomical convenience or an adaptation. So just see a receptor spiral in this manner. So it means that it is likely to sense some change in terms of length. So either an increment or a decrement. whereby our motor reply will just be coming to try to reconcile this length. So if there was some form of overstretch, the motor reply by the gamma will be there to restore our stretch from the over to and also reduce it. So we'll be able to see that. We've suggested for us to make a good reflex arc, you need to also appreciate the sensory wing. So for the sensory wing, you are able to see some type 1A. We also have the type 1B, and here we also have the type 2. So specifically telling us where our nerves are originating from the muscle. So the type A, they are having their receptor spreading from the what we call the primary ending to the secondary ending, while the type 2 just originating from the secondary ending. So we'll be able to see the specific name depending on how the nucleus are arranged within this particular area. So for the secondary, it could be that the nucleus are arranged in a chain manner. So I don't know if you can force it over here. So this is how the nucleus are likely to be arranged. So sometimes referred to as the linear chain. This over here, we are likely to have some nucleus overcrowding in a particular area. Sometimes the primary ending referred to as the nuclear bug. So these are representing just some specific area within the muscle spindle. So if we enlarge that a little bit, so you focus on this intrafusal area. So if we enlarge it, this is what you are likely to get. The primary part and the secondary part. So the secondary, we are having the type 2 fiber only originating from the nuclear bug. Not nuclear bug, but the nuclear chain. So it is a nuclear chain because we are able to see some nucleus arranged in a chain, not really a chain, I wouldn't want to say a chain, but in a longitudinal manner or in a linear way. While here we are having some nucleus just packed, suggesting a bug. So why are these important? This is important because if you go back into the gamma, we'll be having different types of gamma neurons. We suggested the lower motor neurons, we have two major types, the alpha and the gamma. While in the gamma we can have two types, the dynamic and the static. So for example, the type A can also be referred to as the primary afferent, meaning that they are having their receptor from the nuclear bug and the nuclear chain, and after that they are likely to give us some motor reply, of course using the dynamic. But which type of dynamic? It should be that which again affects both the nuclear bug and the nuclear chain, while the other one we should just be having a dynamic fiber. So into the intrafusal, we have the muscle spindle. So the muscle spindle, we've seen that we have the primary sensory endings and the secondary sensory ending. So the primary sensory ending starts their receptors start from the nuclear bug, and we also have that which starts from the linear chain. While the secondary we are likely to have their receptors only starting from the nuclear chain. And as you can be able to see, it is likely now that we are just using one area, it is likely that the secondary are having a much smaller diameter, while this one a much bigger diameter. So anything bigger telling you that they are likely to to propagate information in a much faster way. So from the intrafusal, we are likely to have some form of impulse generation. So the impulse generation should be a representation of the length. The length, remember, is a part of the proprioception modality that is normally picked at the muscle level. So at the muscle spindle, we are likely to generate some electrical impulse representing some change in length. But as you've been able to see, we have two types of fibers: the primary sensory and the secondary. So which have some secondary ending and the primary ending, depending on the areas of the intrafusal. So the primary sensory ending, upon excitation, if you are supposed to have some motor reply, we are likely to get a dynamic response. So a dynamic response is only elicited when the length is increasing, and that is fast. So this is telling you that you're having a muscle like this. So let's say you stretch your muscle from point A to whichever point. So during this time of stretching, as you are stretching, maybe depending on the speed of the stretch, as you are stretching just slowly, that is when you are able to generate some impulse. Impulse is only generated in action, in the act of the strength, or in the act of the change in length. So that is because of that change, that is some form of a dynamic impulse. So for us to get a response, you are likely to elicit a dynamic response. So we'll need to give a motor a reply that will change, or maybe that will be able to stop this kind of movement. We can also have a static response. So that means that if you are having some your muscle may be stretching, so this is the normal muscle. So if it stretches up to this point, provided the muscle is stretched, it will generate impulse continuously. So provided it is stretching, it will be able to generate impulse continuously. So this is unlike with the dynamic. So the dynamic only generates impulses only when stretching. So let's say that it had stretched and maybe remained stagnant at this point. So when it is stagnant and maybe it has stretched and it is no longer changing, it won't be able to generate some impulse. So it only generates impulse when it is in the act of stretching. So that's why we need to have the impulse generation for the two. This is because the other one, it is likely to elicit a response when it is changing and also when it has stopped. So we'll only stop the impulse generation by these receptors or sensory endings over here when we revert our length of the muscle from this point of the stretch to the normal length. So it is until we regain a normal length, that is when we are likely to stop the static response. Why is this important? So these are very important in many reflexes. Remember the stretch reflexes that we suggested. They were very important because the stretch reflex is likely to prevent the muscle from damage. This is the sense. If you are increasing the length, there will be some impulse generation, a motor reply that seeks to restore the length to the normal. So when you restore the length to the normal, it will prevent overstretching that can possibly present with some form of rupture. So these are very important. We have the dynamic and the static response. The dynamic response, it is only elicited when we are changing, or maybe when the length is increasing. If it stops, we'll stop the generation. All of these are very important, and these responses will be executed by the motor wing of the gamma. So the gamma dynamic type, gamma dynamic neuron, and for this one, gamma static neuron. So if you are able to, if I refer you back to this image, what you are seeing, the primary we've suggested, it is good for the dynamic. So upon stimulation, it will evoke a response by the dynamic. While the other one, it can be very good for the secondary, that is the static. So the response, of course, will be executed by the two types of the gamma. The two types of the gamma that we are seeing is the gamma D, representing the dynamic, and the gamma S, representing the gamma static. That means if we are having some change or some electrical generation, we need to get an immediate, almost an equal reply to be able to prevent the damage. So remember, one of the important roles of these reflexes were to prevent maybe some overstretch that has the potential of damaging the tissues. As an integratory area, we've also appreciated that we have some interneurons. So interneurons are present in all areas of the spinal cord, that is the gray matter, in the dorsal horn and the anterior horns and the intermediate areas between them. So these cells are about 30 times as numerous compared to the anterior motor neurons. They are small but are highly excitable. So some are excitable, or maybe some are excitatory, while some are inhibitory. And they are also likely to have similar neuronal circuit that we suggested while covering the neuronal pools, whereby they are also likely to have this sequence, some diverging. They are likely to have some diverging, convergence, and also repetitive discharge. Remember the reverberation and the oscillation, as we suggested. All these properties of the neuronal circuit are what are able to qualify neuronal arrangement as an integratory area. Because as a neuron, you need to receive information and sometimes spread this information to different areas of either the brain or the peripheral nervous system. Sometimes you need to take information from different areas and be able to converge it, while sometimes you need to be arranged in a specific way so that we ensure some electrical generation that is majorly independent from many other areas, and of course other types of circuit. So remember, I don't know if you're able to remember, but one of the interneurons that were very important that we covered last time, remember the painkiller system, the pain modulatory system. One of them was the periaqueductal. We suggested that if this painkiller system are activated, they are able to release something like maybe enkephalin or many other form of opioids to be able to maybe trigger one of the descending serotonergic pathway to be able to release some serotonin. So this serotonin can be released maybe to be able to interact with some interneurons. Once stimulated, likely to give us some inhibitory role. But what we are specifically referring to are the interneurons that are very important in modulating some motor movement. So only a few incoming sensory signal, as we are able to suggest, are likely to have a direct termination with the anterior motor neurons. So remember the type 1A interacting with the alpha motor neuron, ignoring the interneurons. So this is just a few of these kind of arrangement that you expect, but most of the time neurons are likely to join together in the spinal cord using the interneuron. So depending on the type of the interneuron involved, they can either be excitatory or inhibitory, or sometimes just modulatory. A good example over here, the corticospinal tract from the brain is shown to terminate almost entirely on spinal interneurons, where the signal from these tracts combine with the signal from the other spinal tract or the spinal nerves before finally converging to the motor neurons. So this is very good. So remember what we were suggesting. So let's say we are having an interneuron over here. So let's for convenient purpose, let's just draw two. You're having an interneuron, and then from this interneuron, on the ventral part, they are joined with the cell body of the anterior motor neurons. So while we are having a corticospinal signal getting from the brain, so remember we were also talking about some other reflexes that are very important, or maybe how sometimes the neuronal impulses need to be propagated to be able to ensure effective movement. So this is an excitatory. So let's assume this is an excitatory and this is an inhibitory. So we are having just information flowing from the cortical spine. So on this other part, if it interacts with these interneurons, it can end up activating the lower motor neuron. While at this side, if it is inhibitory, it might end up giving us an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So maybe just to remind us, the most important form of inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord is normally the glycine. While you can also have the GABA. The GABA is mostly in the brain. Glycine is mostly in the spinal cord. So the inhibitory causing maybe inhibits the lower motor neurons from active. So remember what you are suggesting, that sometimes you need to, while you are activating other group of muscles, the other need to be able to relax, so that at the end of the day, we have a well coordinated movement. How is that possible? That is possible because of these interneurons. Interneurons, we can have both excitatory and inhibitory on the same side. But for us, sometimes to have that efficient form of movement, you'll see a specific track exciting an excitatory interneuron on this other side, while inhibitory interneuron on the other side. So unless you are in some disease states where maybe things like epilepsy, where you can have some uncoordinated kind of muscle contraction, imagine what will happen if you excite both sides. So this is not to mean left and right, It is just there to mean different group of muscles. So the anterior and maybe the posterior muscle. The movement is not likely to occur if you are having both the anterior and the posterior muscle contracting. So you are likely to be in a spastic state, and that represents a disease process whereby maybe you're having a depletion of inhibitory neurotransmitter or excesses with these excitatory neurotransmitters. So also in the anterior horns, we also have some other specialized type of interneurons. So these are called the Renshaw cells that transmit inhibitory signals to the motor neuron. So just know the very important role of the interneuron. So interneurons allows individuals to be able, or maybe allows the nerves to be able to modulate the kind of information, to decide whether to give it an excitatory or an inhibitory. So whereby in some few connection where you can have the direct connection between the sensory and the motor, we normally have minimal control in terms of excitation of the electrical impulses of the lower motor neuron, so which is likely just to be a direct excitation. So it is from that you are able to form this basic arc. For example, this is an arc representing the stretch reflex, telling you that at the muscle spindle, we are able to sense some change in terms of stretch, sending appropriate information to the spinal cord, synapsing immediately with the motor anterior motor nerve to be able to give us an adequate or a good reply. And because it is a reflex, just think of this, you want the shortest route but effective as possible. So where you don't need most of the time the interneurons, where you don't need to take this information all the way to the brain so that it is processed and be back. You just want something to be able to be acted upon immediately. And that's why some of these reflexes can also be seen in unconscious patient, because we don't actually require their consciousness. So one of the reflexes is the muscle stretch reflex. This is the simple manifestation of the muscle spindle function. Is the muscle stretch reflex. Whenever a muscle is stretched suddenly, there will be an excitation of the muscle spindle, causing some electrical impulse generation that goes into the spinal cord to cause the reflex contraction of the large skeletal muscle of the stretch. So we are able to have the reply of the stretch with some form of contraction, and of course that is serving one major purpose: to avoid tone and tears that it is highly likely if this node process it is not well checked. So an explanation of the muscle stretch reflex. We have the type 1A fiber from the muscle spindle through the dorsal root, enters the gray horn directly to the anterior horn, where it synapses directly to the anterior motor neuron gamma A. And remember the kind of response that you're likely to get. So with the gamma, we were having the S and the dynamic part. So remember this, because it is fast, it should be a dynamic response, and the reply or maybe the sensation that we are getting, it is likely by the primary sensory endings that is involving both the nuclear bag and the linear chain of the nuclear. So this is a representation of the monosynaptic pathway. That means that we are ignoring the many other synapses. We've ignored the interneurons, so that our sensory neurons are able to synapse directly with the anterior neurons, motor neurons, and this is to minimize the amount of time that is likely to be used, because for the reflex we want things to be really quick. So most type 2 fibers from the muscle spindle terminate on the multiple interneurons in the cord gray matter. This transmit delay signal to the anterior motor neurons or serve other function. So remember, with this, this is likely to be static. This is what is likely to find itself. The same information propagated through the type 2 is what is likely to get into the brain eventually. So remember the spinocerebellar that were also very important in transmitting some of the proprioception sensation. So if you need to get through the brain, up to the brain, you definitely need to innervate the interneurons so that you form, you join the track and ascend on your way to the cerebellum, or all the way to the other regions of the brain, but mostly the cerebellum, or sometimes through the thalamus first before we divert, if you remember the other form of the track. Any question before we continue? Let's get into the Golgi tendon reflex. Obviously, when you talk of the Golgi tendon reflex, what we are concerned with, we are basically using the Golgi tendon as the receptor rather than the muscle spindle. So we should be able to get much information in terms of tension and not too much in terms of the length or the stretch. So this, we are able to generate this by the Golgi tendon. And of course, we are able to see the specific nerve fiber, the type 1B, that is able to get the information from the Golgi tendon area, take it to the spinal cord. While at the spinal cord, they are able to synapse with the interneuron to be able to excite the lower motor neuron to be able to give us the right reply. This is likely to be via the alpha neurons. So sometimes not even sometimes it could be through the interneurons or even directly, which is likely to give us appropriate reply to able to restore the normal tone of the muscles. So let's explore the Golgi tendon reflex. Golgi tendon organ is an encapsulated sensory receptor through the muscle tendon fiber. About 10 to 15 muscle fibers are usually connected to each Golgi tendon, and the organ is stimulated when the small muscles of the fiber is tensed, or by contracting or stretching of the muscle. Thus, the major difference in the excitation of the Golgi tendons versus the muscle spindle is that the spindle detects the muscle length and the changes in muscle length. So remember the static and the dynamic, whereas the tendons only dictates the tension. The transmission of the impulse from the Golgi tendon is normally by the type 1B nerve fiber, as you are able to see. This is normally slightly smaller than the type 1A fiber. So the type 1A fiber should be giving us the information from the sensory endings. So remember primary sensory ending. Remember the nuclear bag and the linear chain. So this will advance all the way into the spinal cord, up to the dorsal region of the spinal cord, where they are likely to synapse with some many other neurons. It could be with the ascending neurons, one of them the spinocerebellar to the cerebellum, while the other synapse with the inhibitory neurons to inhibit the anterior motor neurons. So the inhibition is very important, because when you inhibit you prevent the muscle from further contracting. While this could be a pathway to tell us more about the reflex. While we also agree that the proprioception signals are also very important for the cerebellum to be able to give us some decision that we'll be able to see. So we have two destinations, some ending at the interneuron level, some synapsing with the spinocerebellar, to be transmitted all the way to the cerebellum area. I hope you are able to see that what we've suggested. The type B fiber originating from the Golgi tendon area or the Golgi tendon organ. So the Golgi tendon organ, these are receptors that are there between many fibers, around 10 to 15. So any change in tension, tension is by way of contraction, it is likely to press onto these receptors to be able to give us some electrical impulses. So what is generating electrical impulses? It is the tension or the contraction. So the electrical impulses are likely to be transmitted through the type B fiber all the way into the spinal cord. Of course, as a sensory neuron, remember there need to be some form of synapsing so that this becomes the secondary or the second order types of neurons, all the way to the spinal cord of the dorsal area where they synapse with the interneuron. So if they synapse with the interneuron, what do? They give us some inhibitory, they give us some form of inhibition. So why do we require an inhibition? The inhibition will be able to prevent this muscle from further contracting. So you can say that when the alpha motor neuron is stimulated, it is likely to cause some form of contraction. So for us to have a good appropriate reply is that when there is some form of excessive contraction, specifically the type 1B fiber will excite the inhibitory interneurons to cause some inhibition into our alpha motor neuron, and therefore what are we likely to experience? Some form of relaxation. While what you need to remember with the alpha motor neuron, it is not only receiving the information from the interneurons, it can also receive the information directly from the type 1A fiber, so which had some form of the primary sensory endings, where it was able to tell us an information in regard to length and tension. So this can directly stimulate the alpha motor neurons to be able to cause some contraction, because it is highly likely that when the length is increasing, you can a contraction can be an adequate response to prevent further maybe stretch or further stretch, because when you're having stretch, we are not necessarily discriminating. It could be longitudinal or in this other way, or an horizontal way. So this is the connection as we are able to see, whereby if the alpha motor neuron is activated, it is likely to act through around the same region, the extrafusal region. But in this case, we are seeing an inhibition. So that inhibition represents the Golgi tendon reflex. So that whenever there's too much contraction, we need to get a motor response that tells the body or maybe the muscle not to not to contract, and this is because we are seeing some form of inhibition. The inhibition is only possible because of the interneurons. It is only possible because of some neurotransmitters. An example we suggested majorly the glycine. So you can try to imagine what will happen minus this, minus the neurotransmitter. We can expect too much contraction without attempt to restore the contraction back to normal. And some of these diseases will present with muscle spasm. So when the Golgi tendon organ of the muscles are stimulated by increased tension in the connecting muscles, signal will be transmitted to the spinal cord, as we've been able to demonstrate in that image. And upon reaching the interneuron, it will be able to generate a respective reflex. So this reflex is entirely inhibitory. Thus, the reflexive provides a negative feedback mechanism that prevents the muscle from too much tension on the muscle, because we know that too much tension can also cause injury. Too much tension also means excessive utilization of maybe oxygen and the available nutrients. And you'll understand, if you are getting a lot of spasm, this can predispose somebody to condition that can present with lactic acidosis, not acidosis really, but lactic acid accumulating within the muscle, presenting with pain. So that is part and parcel of the spasm. So you need to understand that. So another reflex, we have a reflex by the name of flexor reflex and the withdrawal reflex. So this we are able to suggest last time, but let's just have a small recap. In the spinal cord or the cerebrate animals, almost any type of cutaneous sensory stimulus from the limb is likely to cause the extensor muscle of the limb to contract, whereby the withdrawing a limb from the muscle, withdrawing the limb from the stimulating object. So this is called the flexor reflex. And the good example that we suggested was subjecting a hand maybe to a hot object. So the hot object is likely to cause somebody to withdraw. So maybe what is unique with the flexor reflex, away from the muscle stretch and the Golgi tendon, it is that in this kind of reflex, we'll be forming an arc that is not necessarily relying on the muscles or maybe nerves, or maybe nerves that are within the muscles. So with our two reflexes, we've seen our sensory aspect emanating from the muscle itself. But with this one, we can have some sensation emanating from some different areas. So anything that, remember the pain receptors, and the pain receptors, these were the nerve endings, and the type of fiber that were being explored. So we had the type beta, and we had the delta, and we also had the C. So we are ignoring the C, or we are using the type A beta, so which is likely to give us some fast response. So the type A beta being explored over there because of some pain modality. When they get into the spinal cord, while we can have some information joining the spinothalamic nerves or tracts advancing into the thalamus, we can have some joining the interneurons. The interneurons are likely to be excitatory, an excitatory interneuron, whereby if an excitatory interneuron is involved, it will cause the muscle to contract, and gain the stability to withdraw from the offending object. So this is the reflexor reflex or the withdrawal reflex. While we also admitted that during the same time we can have another reflex that we are able to refer to as the extensor reflex. So while at the same time we are involving the excitatory neurotransmitter, we can involve inhibitory neurotransmitters in the other group of the limb to be able to advance almost near to the offending agent. And we agreed that the reason why we need to advance almost maybe adjacent to the offending agent so that this limb is able to give us some form of support. It is able to give us some support. So while you are lifting one leg, you expect the other leg to stay in the ground. At least that will be able to offer the support. So this the opposite phenomenon is represented by the extensor reflex, while the other one is the flexor reflex, where we are exploring the excitatory neurotransmitters or the excitatory interneurons, while at this other one most possibly inhibitory interneurons. So most strong flexor reflex are likely to be elicited by pain nerving endings, and to a lesser extent by touch. So touch, we are not likely to have a strong response unless there are some many other factors like some form of disgust. So most of these signals of the reflex traverse many neurons and involve the following basic types of circuit: diverging circuits to spread the reflex to the necessary muscles for withdrawal. That is making sense because sometimes you are not just withdrawing one type of muscle, a group of muscles need to be involved. This makes more sense because the point of neuronal sensation was just as light, or what was just a small point. So maybe a prick in just a small surface area. But the response that you are getting is involving a wide group of muscle, possibly even involving the other limb. So how is that possible? It means this information needs to get to the spinal cord or whichever integratory area, and then after integration, or after not really perception because it is not conscious, we can direct a motor response to many other muscles. So we are diverging. We can also see a circuit to inhibit the antagonist muscles. This is called the reciprocal inhibition of the circuit. So this is what we suggested. It's likely to make much more sense when you extend the flexor reflex to be the opposite of the extensor. So sometimes you can have the circuit to cause the after discharge lasting many fraction or second after the stimulus is over. So where you are still having some form of withdrawal despite just having a one-time stimulation. You know, it will be making sense if somebody says that I'm giving you a continual insult. So if there's a continual insult in terms of pain, you should also be having some continuous withdrawal from the offending agent. But most of the time you're just likely to get one insult, but you keep on withdrawing, not repetitively, but the muscle might remain in a contracted form. So maybe you've stepped on a needle and for a moment the opposite side steps on the ground, while this one remains not suspended but remains lifted for maybe a fraction of seconds. This represents a continuous discharge to the motor through the motor to the muscles minus the continuous sensory impulse. So this is possible if we are having some type of circuit that allows impulse to reverberate, or an oscillatory kind of circuit. So we've seen how that can also be applied by these reflexes. So a good example, the flexor reflex. And the extensor reflex, so involving the other group of muscles. So as this one is getting some excitement, for it to contract, the posterior muscles of the arms need to relax, because if they contract, you won't be able to have a say in terms of whether to withdraw or not. You'll just remain in a stiff position, and a stiff position will mean that you'll remain attached to the offending agent. So I hope you are able to see that sense. So of course these signals are not likely to continue forever, especially in a manner where we are suggesting that you only got a simple neuronal stimulation, but you are getting continuous motor reply because of this oscillation over here. So somebody will assume that an individual will might have their limb lifted for a very long time. So this will not be the case, because remember the other aspect that we are able to suggest, ways of neuronal stabilization. So one way was fatigue, so it can fatigue, or after some times, remember every group of muscles, every group of nerve, they can have their interneurons that can give them some excitation or some inhibition. So after some times we can have a response by some inhibition, firing off the impulses that was there. So this will be fired off totally by the inhibitory neurotransmitter, or the inhibitory neurons that will be generated. So you shouldn't be concerned by the non-ending circuit. We have ways of ending the circuit through the fatigue or activation of some other inhibitory neurotransmitter. So this is the extensor that we've just discussed. So we also have another reflex. So this is referred to as the reflex of the posture and the locomotion. A postural and locomotive reflex of the quad. Positive support reaction. So this is pressure on the foot pad of a decerebrate animal causes the limb to extend against the pressure applied to the foot. The reflex often stiffens the limbs and suddenly to support it. So a simple explanation will be this. So considering that maybe this is a limb, so the limb that is stepping on onto the ground, of course it is exerting some pressure on the ground, and you can guess what the ground is doing. The ground is also exerting a similar kind of pressure, or maybe a force that is representing the weight of the limb or the weight of the body. So how is the limb, or how are these muscles responding to this stimuli over here? So instead of retracting away from the ground, this causes the muscle, or this causes the limb to further press this area with a lot of force. And why is that important? This is important for stability, for the posture. And of course, you are able to see the importance of the surface area of the foot. That could be very important. So we also have a very important reflexes, the stepping and the walking movement. So I'll want you to explore on that, and specifically I'll want you to map how this is likely to develop, because you know that as a kid or as a child, you might not have this reflex form adequately, but as an adult, we know that your stability will be gained, or you'll be able to gain it. But as you grow old, again, you deteriorate. So I want you to explore the circumstances. Is it because of the development, or also maybe how the spinal cord is shaped, and maybe the center of the gravity, because these are things that are very important. So if with the time you get old and you start to bend, of course, you'll be altering your center of gravity. So I want you to explore some of the physical circumstances that can influence this process, and then